Yeah, so in the labels, they tend to only pull out what's going to be important for you to know for the health. The same reason the vitamins change, the minerals change, because that's what's going to be important for you to know. So some of the labels will even leave off saturated fat and have only trans fats. Carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are your sugars. You have simple sugars, you have starch sugars, which are longer sugars, so chains of multiple simple sugars put together. And then there are fibers as well. Fiber, on the other hand, is long sugars that your body doesn't digest well. And the importance of knowing the difference between those is simple sugars like glucose, that's what your brain runs off of. So you can't not have any in your diet. However, it's not typically very filling. It's quick energy, but it's not fulfilling energy. That's why you feel good after you drink a little bit of Coke, but a couple hours later you kind of feel down in the dumps again. Whereas dietary fiber kind of helps regulate your blood sugars. It can help with that more. Protein is that building block of life that you need for everything. And it's a combination of several different types of molecules and does a good job of helping you feel more satisfied, more satiated, and can keep you from having those quick sugar cravings that you really need. Now here we go on the vitamins. So like we were saying, vitamin A, vitamin C got kicked off. People have a hard time getting vitamin D, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And then calcium. And these are just the things that are key components in different body processes that you're carrying out as you're sitting here. So that's kind of why they were featured on the label. This section is another one that's been removed in most of the newer labels, and it's just kind of the reference section to kind of tell you where your calories going in different calorie diets. So in the 2,000 versus 2,500 calorie diet. Okay, more Hawaii. This is an observatory on Mauna Kea, which is a volcano on the Big Island. So Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa are the two twin volcanoes there. Mauna Loa, you may have noticed in the news, they were doing NASA was doing an experiment there with 6 scientists where they basically trapped them in a habitat, made them pretend that they were on Mars for a year. They just got out this past weekend. Mauna Kea has several observatories, and Hawaii does lots of work with not only the United States but other countries in doing lots of astronomical studies and looking for all kinds of things. These observatories right now are pretty controversial in Hawaii because the native Hawaiian population regards Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa as sacred sites, and they're trying to build another big telescope that will help us look into the far reaches of the universe and find things like exoplanets. But the Hawaiians are asking, please don't dig on our sacred sites, please don't build these things anymore. So there's kind of big movements in Hawaii against this now. But it's a really great place to visit, very cool, and as you can see, you can drive or hike up there and end up above the clouds. So why do I need these things? What's important? You say grow, sustain, who cares? But there are some diseases that can happen when you have deficiencies, especially in the different vitamins and minerals. So these are some kids. This is at the turn of the 20th century. And highlighted here are some of the bony abnormalities they have. And this is a disease called Rickets. So this is vitamin D deficiency. It's one of those things that we started putting on the labels. Vitamin D is something that's made in your skin. You're required to be outside in the sun for your body to make vitamin D. It's something that's not very readily available in the diet, except now we've started fortifying foods because it was such a problem in the past. So these kids end up with, and there's an adult form also, it's called osteomalacia, a little bit different. But these kids end up with soft bones, and so you'll notice oftentimes you'll see pictures where they have curved long bones, so that's your bones in your arms and the big bones in your legs. And then they get knobs at their epiphyseal plates, and that's the growth plate in their bones. So they don't, the vitamin D and calcium are both required for your bones to mineralize, and if you don't have those, then they can't mineralize, so your bones end up soft, and as you grow, they tend to bend with your weight. And at the turn of the 20th century, these kids were called latchkey children. So as people started moving into the cities to work at industrial jobs, their kids were kept inside all the time. So whereas their rural cousins were able to be outside and play in the sun, the kids in the city were kept at home inside, and so you started seeing lots of these problems coming up in these kids with their bones having issues. So they started fortifying food in the 1930s with vitamin D. So a lot of times you'll see it in dairy products because, again, you need the calcium and the vitamin D together. This one is a kind of skin rash, so you can see. This is another deficiency. It's called Pellagra, and it's a niacin or a vitamin B3 deficiency. So this one causes a rash. You can get diarrhea, dementia, have problems with your cognition. And eventually, if you're not able to rectify this, you can have death, you die. Niacin is an important molecule to help build energy that your body uses to do things like the very small energy molecules. And the reason it became a problem was as agriculture started booming in the United States, people started relying on corn as their main sustenance and moving away from the other grains. Corn, however, has niacin. It's a great source, but the availability isn't there if you're not able to treat the corn appropriately. And the makers of these corn flours and corn meals weren't treating it. So they started noticing all of these problems and then traced it back to, it seems that this problem comes up in this community when people are relying on corn. So let's see if we can't figure out what is it about the corn that's a problem. May remember from history class or not, that corn is a New World crop. So Indians started raising it here, the Native Americans, and they actually, in the way that they made maize into cornmeal themselves, the type of stones they were using, that type of thing, actually treated the corn. So they had already solved the problem before they ever really realized that it was there. So just by their traditional methods. This poor kiddo looks pretty miserable. You can see his protuberant belly, swollen hands and feet. This kid is suffering from something called Kwashiorkor, and that's a protein malnutrition. You may have seen it in all of those infomercials about send a quarter to wherever in the third world to help feed this baby. And that's where it's most common now. Very rarely do we see it, in the first world or even in middle developing countries, but especially in the third world. It causes edema, and then the swelling and the water in between the layers of the skin cause ulcerations, and then those get infected. You can also have hair and tooth loss. So as I said, protein is really important for all of the building blocks of life and all of the building blocks of your tissue. And when you don't have that, the fluid actually kind of leaks out of your blood vessels and into your tissues. That's where the swelling comes from. And the reason their bellies, though it looks like they might be full and eating plenty, it's actually that their intestines are all swollen. That's why they look like that. So protein's very, very important to your diet as well. So lastly, this one is a picture of a baby with a spinal defect. This is Spina bifida. And this is actually one of the great kind of public health things that has happened really recently. So in 1992, the FDA asked food manufacturers to start fortifying foods with folate. And the reason is they were able to find out that spina bifida seems to be related to the amount of folate that a mother's consuming relatively early in her pregnancy, most of the time before women even realize that they're pregnant. So that's not the only thing that causes spina bifida. So there are still cases that we see even in women that were taking a prenatal vitamin or eating their cereal that has folate within it. But this has been one of those modifiable things where he said, okay, these people that have more folate for some reason don't have these same problems. And spina bifida is an important thing to look at because these kids tend to have lots of disability problems, movement disorders, and require lots of care, which then, is paid for by their families and by the general taxpayers. So you can decrease the risk by just taking any woman's multivitamin, has extra folate in it, and then, like I said, cereals and other things are now fortified with folate to decrease the risk of this. What about too much of a good thing? So obesity. It's commonly classified based on BMI. BMI is not the perfect thing. I can run 10 miles. I don't have a perfect BMI. But it's really the best that we have right now. And despite the fact that I can run 10 miles, that doesn't mean that I'm not at the same risk of someone who's more stationary than I am, who has the same BMI. That's the unfortunate side to BMI. It seems to pan out when you look at the research. The other key thing to remember is changing your weight is really, really hard. It takes a while. Your body gets to this homeostasis with your weight, and you then have to kind of reset that homeostasis point to help deal with your weight. And basically it comes down to calories in versus calories out. Obesity is increasing across all the generations. Kids are bigger, babies are bigger, moms and dads are bigger, grandparents are bigger. Older individuals in the population up to about the age of 75 are even getting bigger. Here in the US, about a third of adults are classified as overweight or obese. And then Floridians themselves report about the same. So this picture graph here is showing that Florida is in the yellow, so that's 25 to just less than 30% of people consider themselves obese or overweight in the state of Florida. And then non-Hispanic blacks have the highest rates of obesity. The last stat that I heard was like of African American women, 57% of them are considered overweight or obese. And those are staggeringly high numbers. So like I said, I'm an OBGYN. I focus more than half my time on pregnant women. And in pregnancy, obesity increases the risk for everyone involved and through the duration. So babies are at higher risk of problems like neural tube defects, cardiac defects, so heart problems, cleft lip, cleft palate, which can have problems for the baby in the future, not only with just feeding, speech, and then puts them at risk for things like surgery and all that kind of stuff. So that's while they're in utero developing. The babies then, as their life continues on, if mom is obese while she's pregnant, kind of this new area of research called epigenetics, so looking at what genes are turned off and on while the baby is developing, seem to show that these kids are at higher risk for obesity, metabolic syndrome, which is hypertension, diabetes, increased waist circumference, and even some behavioral health problems, ADD and ADHD, are at increased risk if mother is obese and diabetic during her pregnancy. The mother herself, if she's obese when she gets pregnant, is at increased risk for having a C-section, which is, despite what the media may have you believe, not all doctors want to do C-sections all day long. But she's also at risk for high blood pressure problems and preeclampsia in pregnancy. She's at risk for diabetes in pregnancy, which just makes pregnancy all the more miserable because you've got to poke yourself all the time. And she's at risk for having a bigger baby and needing more interventions in her labor. So having an abnormal labor curve where she's not able to deliver like we would typically expect. So it just makes everything harder. And then as people age, obesity even continues into the older age. So we used to see it less commonly in those considered older, 65, 75, and even the very aged, which is the over 75 crowd. But it seems to be increasing even among those people. Generally decreases after 75 years old, but is still slowly increasing, just not as much as the rest of the population. But that's likely due to the fact that these people just aren't surviving to that age. So all these people have more problems with hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol problems, heart disease. And then another thing to always remember is carrying extra weight makes it harder on your joints. So we see younger people with arthritic problems and degenerative joint problems. More Hawaii pictures. This is a surf break in Maui. It's called Piahi or Jaws. And it is one of the premier big wave surf places. So big waves, 25 to 30 foot bases. And it's a really kind of great place to go out to. You take this dirt sugarcane road out to a cliff, and this is the view from the cliff. So you don't have to deal with all the sand and mess of the beach, but you still get to watch some great surf. So why can't it just melt away? Fat should just be able to melt away, right? If I do enough of those, like whatever light treatments or rub it just right. However, like we discussed, there are evolutionary reasons for why what tastes good. We used to be the caveman walking around, trying to find what we needed, having to walk miles, having to hunt something, set traps, be busy all of the time, just trying to get enough calories so that our body could function. Now, we can drive up to McDonald's, order our 1,000-calorie meal, eat it in our car, walk 15 steps into our house, sit down on our couch. We don't really have to expend much energy at all to function. And that has led to this lovely progression that you can see here. So how do we deal with that? Exercise, we can do strength training, resistance training, weight training. Having increased muscle mass helps increase your metabolism. For women, it's really important, especially as you approach perimenopause and menopausal age. It can increase your bone strength, which is really the only benefit of being obese, is you're less likely to have osteoporosis because you've been carrying around all that extra weight. But the strength training can be really great. The recommendation is to do all of your major muscle groups at least twice weekly. So that's a fair amount of time spent at the gym, right? And then you have cardiovascular training. That's your aerobic training. What that does is make your body a more efficient machine. Your heart can pump more blood around with fewer pumps. Your blood vessels work better, and you're just able to process better. You're able to exchange oxygen in your lungs better. And the recommendation there is at least 150 minutes. Better to do 300 minutes weekly. So if you think about it, that sounds like a lot, but it's not that bad. And then diet. Sadly, if I could run enough to eat all of the chocolate chip cookies that I could, that might be a fair trade. But it doesn't seem to work that way. Exercise and dietary changes work much better together. There's kind of a synergism there between the two, so they help each other out. Dietary changes can be especially difficult to make, however. Especially if you don't have good choices, you're not sure what's a good choice, then it can be really difficult. And it can be a little bit more expensive to shop healthfully. And then you have to put in the time. How do I cook this? What am I supposed to do? So we're going to talk about a few of the diets. A couple are my favorite, a couple are my less favorite. So the DASH diet, the dietary approach to stopping hypertension, that's a diet that focuses on vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and the idea is to decrease your sodium. So this is one of those, it restricts one thing, really, and the idea is to keep your sodium below this 2,300 milligrams level, and that's to help deal with hypertension. So this was initially developed to help people with hypertension, but that's not the only thing it's able to do, because it focuses on fruits, vegetables, over, especially animal protein sources. Then you end up eating those things that are more nutrient rich and more calorie poor, which is better off for you. So this is kind of an example of different things you can have in the DASH diet. And if you look at all those servings, that's a lot throughout the day that you can eat. It's kind of surprising. Followed DASH for a little while, and it was like, I can't eat all of these green beans. I don't want them anymore. Glycemic Index. So this is something kind of similar to a diabetic type diet, where it looks at food and it kind of classifies food based on how it's going to raise your blood sugar when you eat it. So this is really looking at those carbohydrates and looking, okay, who's got simple sugars, who's got fiber, who's got, the in-between carbohydrates. And then kind of giving those a rating. And the reason that they started looking at this glycemic index was following people who had recorded eating foods that were high on this index, so that raised your blood sugar a lot. Those people tended to have more diabetes, more cardiovascular problems, with heart plaques and having heart attacks and strokes. So using that research, looking back, they then put people on these diets and showed that they could decrease their risk for all of these things. So it can be a potentially healthy diet. It's kind of one that's a little bit more rigorous, and you have to pay a little bit more attention to the food that you're eating. So some stuff, like clearly ice cream's pretty high, but if you look at some of the fruits, ice cream and bananas, they're pretty close to the same rating. So bananas, get you a 54, which is in the medium. Ice cream gets you a 61, which is still in the medium. But I like fruit, so I'm not a big fan of that one. Then the paleo diet. This one, is kind of hyped a little bit. It's the caveman diet. I didn't realize till I started doing some research. It was developed initially in the 1960s, so it's been around a while. And the idea when it was initially developed was to eliminate the diseases of civilization. So they were particularly thinking about hypertension, diabetes, those type of things. And the idea is you eat like a caveman. So it's centered on meat and vegetables with a few fruits, no processed foods, no cereal grains. You can't have your Wheaties in the morning, none of that. No dairy and no legumes, which are all the beans, that kind of stuff. This one, you kind of have to take with a grain of salt, I think. Because the other thing to remember is the fruits and vegetables that we see now, that's nothing like fruits and vegetables look like in caveman times. So we've kind of developed them, and farmers have been great at breeding watermelons that have this huge center of great delicious fruit when watermelons used to be poisonous. So, it's hard to think that this is good. The good thing about it is there's a good focus with paleo diets of thinking about what's on your plate, cooking it yourself, taking it from the raw thing, getting out of the processed foods so you don't end up with those trans fats, those chemically developed fats that help food preserve for a long time. The problem with when you don't have foods that are well preserved is you've got to cook them right then, eat them then, or else you end up with a lot of waste, and that can be really expensive. There's kind of an example of the things not allowed on the paleo diet, allowed on the paleo diet. And then vegetarian. I'm from Oklahoma. I always joke with everybody, I'm not allowed to be vegetarian because I'm from Oklahoma. Big cattle raising family. So this is a diet centered around vegetables. No animal proteins. Protein sources are nuts, seeds, legumes, soy, those type of sources. Some will be what they call lacto-ovo vegetarians. So that means they eat lacto, which is the milk, cheese. Eggs are the ovo part of that. Or lacto-vegetarians, they do cheese and milk, but they don't do eggs. Or they're pescatarians, who eat fish, but don't eat other animal products. People that ascribe to a vegetarian diet have to be a little more vigilant to make sure they're including the essential amino acids, minerals, and vitamins. Those ones that our bodies can't make, they have to go out and find and make sure they're getting those in this diet. So, and there's whole portions of the world, like here it shows, 80% of the population in India is vegetarian. They've got great vegetarian food. I love, a good vegetarian curry that's got tofu in there. I can't cook it, but other people do great at it. The U.S., we're 4% vegetarians. We're not very good at this one. All right, this is my last Hawaii picture. This is from the St. Regis Resort in Kauai. Kauai is the garden isle. As you can see there, it's very beautiful and green. Not so populated as some of the other isles. This is one of the big perks of being a resident in Hawaii. You get to go to this really amazing resort for a conference. And it's really pretty and beautiful. More questions? Okay. That's all I've got.